and it is, I've mentioned before, and I'll continue to mention, not chronological. So, if you've been following along, I've talked about different pieces of it. So tonight I want to talk to you about, Ken and I have been dating. This is a piece of the story that comes together. And I was talking to somebody earlier about this. So let me just kind of tell you again, this is, if you don't really understand what I'm doing, I want to explain one more time why I'm doing this. So when you're walking through the midst of your life, you may not recognize, and it's very often that we don't pay attention to the fact that God is in the details and that He is working and moving. And a lot of times we just live life, we go through the motions, we do the things that you're supposed to do, whatever those things are, the natural part of life, and we just think, well, this is how it happened, whatever. But as you begin to, as you study a book like Esther, and you start recognizing that God's hand is in the middle of every single thing in this story, and it's kind of amazing, you can go back to your life and you can say, wait a minute, that was not a coincidence. That couldn't have been a coincidence. There's no way this could make sense unless God was in the middle of it. And it's one of those things where, as I was reading this, I was like, oh my goodness, my story is this, but so is yours. And you may not see that, you may not have thought about it, but if you went back and took time to go through your whole story, you go, wow, yeah, how could that have happened? How we met here and this happened? So you recognize that God is much bigger. The word coincidence is a secular word. It is not a biblical word. There's no such things as coincidences. There really isn't. At the end of the day, that is what people without God are going to say. Oh, what a coincidence. Now, there are things that happen sometimes that are just really lighthearted and easygoing. Maybe God wasn't totally in the middle of some of the silly things that we call coincidences, but any of those things that you go, isn't it a coincidence that I met him at this place? No. Isn't it a coincidence that I decided to do this? No. There are things that we can truly look at and say, these are not coincidences, because that's not biblical. Biblical truth is there is a sovereign God, and His hands are in our world, on our life. And we can look at the Old Testament, New Testament, doesn't matter where you look, and you see God. The Old Testament is a great place to see it because it's so historical. So it's the history of the story of the children of Israel, which I didn't mention that we really, really need to be praying for Israel right now, which I know that you guys are doing that, or you're very aware of it, that a lot of things are happening even as we speak. Right now, a lot of things are happening, going on, and we need to pray for the peace of Israel, because that's where everything's going to go down. And we're not doing a Revelation talk tonight, but maybe we need to. Things are getting serious over there. All right, so I told you that when I was 15 years old, God called me to be a pastor's wife. But at the point when I started dating Ken, he wasn't going to be a pastor. Kind of told you how that story happened last week, of him kind of putting, all of a sudden feeling like God was calling him to be a pastor. And I was like, oh, this is great. But in the midst, before Ken felt called to be a pastor, and I felt called to be a pastor's wife, I started dating Ken, and he wasn't going into the ministry. He was going to be a coach and in the fitness business. So, of course, at this point, I had begun to convince myself that I was supposed to marry a pastor, that this guy was, he was the one. Doesn't matter that he's going to do this because he's a strong Christian, and so I must have not heard God. So that's where I was, right? Correctly. So I'm like, I have to come up with a plan for my life because I can't go to school to be a pastor's wife since now the guy I'm dating isn't. Anyway, I was majoring, obviously before I even met him, when I went to college, my choice of major was mass communications. Now, back in the day, mass communications was, they don't have mass communications anymore, but it was the communications degree that encompassed everything to do with journalism, anything to do with talking, which I was really good at. And I thought, if I got to pick something for a degree, I'm going to pick something where I can talk. Now, I always, back in that time, I thought I was going to, originally I thought I was going to be a movie star. That's a whole other story. I faded in the woodwork later. And I kept my dad, something about maybe Gilligan's Island and Ginger. I don't know. Anyway, So I thought I was going to, but I decided I'm going to be a news broadcaster. So that's what I'm going to do. You get to talk all the time, and that works for my personality, I thought. And I also thought I'm going to have my own talk show one day, which I still want to do that. But anyway, that's another story. So I go into majoring in mass communications. So I'm getting into my major. Ken and I just started dating. He still didn't feel called to be a pastor yet. And so I'm like, kind of now I'm in my major, like starting to take major classes, journalism 101 and blah, 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 blah. And I start having this crisis in my head, like, oh my goodness, I don't think I want to be a news broadcaster. I was watching the news one night and somebody had been, like a terrible tragedy had happened, and the news broadcaster comes up and sticks the microphone in their mouth and their face and goes, how do you feel about that? And I was like, this is awful. I don't want to go up to people in the middle of their tragedy and ask them how they're feeling. This is ridiculous. I was like, I don't think I can do this. I started kind of panicking, like, what am I going to do with my life? Like, I have no plan. No plan. I have nothing else. It was a movie star and a news broadcaster. Never wanted to be anything else, okay? So, except for the pastor's wife, and that was, on the back burner. So, I did have this, kind of had this real interest in helping young people and help. I was going to the BCM, which is BSU back in the day. It was back in the day BSU, Baptist Student Union at my college. And there was an opportunity to go work at a weekend retreat, like go on a weekend retreat with some students and be the camp counselor. So it's like, okay, so several of us from the BSU went as college students to help these high school students at this event. I got there, I was sitting in, they did breakout sessions for you to, go to little breakout sessions. So the breakout session I was sitting in is love, sex, and dating. Yeah, I was in there as the counselor. During this, I remember it well. It was a woman who was speaking, and she was talking to them about this topic, which was a high interest for kids, And so she goes, who could you go to if you have a problem? And the kids would go, raise their hand, parents, friends, high school teacher. And it was like the whole sky opened up. I mean, I'm not kidding you. I felt like there were trumpets, and it was like the whole thing. It was an epic event in my head. Like, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to be a teacher, like a high school teacher. Oh my goodness. Like it truly was like God just announced with the trumpets and everything, you were going to be a teacher. And then in my head, I remember this, guys, it was so clear. What am I going to teach? Because, the first calling was to be a teacher, and then it was like, what am I going to teach? Well, I'm not good at math and science. That is totally out the door. History is boring. Most history teachers are boring. English, I like to write. I'm pretty good at grammar. Okay, I'll be an English teacher. That was exactly how it went. I came out of that, and I'll never forget it. It was so vivid in my mind. I come out of this thing, and I am jumping up and down, which is kind of my personality, especially back then. Jumping down, going crazy like a maniac. I'm going to be a teacher. God just told me, blah, 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 blah. And I was saying that to all my friends that were on this thing. So I walked in the next day. I walked in on that was on a weekend, Saturday, when it happened, I guess. Monday morning, I marched into, because we were getting ready to sign up for our classes for the next semester. It was quarter back then. And I had to sign up for mass communication classes. And I was like, I don't want to do that. That's not what I want to do, because I was really pink. I had never, ever, ever, not once in my entire life wanted to be a teacher. Not once. Teachers were dull, boring, weird, all the things. I had no desire to be a teacher. That was the dumbest job in my head. I was not going to be a teacher. And I had a couple of friends tell me that in high school. You should be a teacher. I was like, no way. That is so boring. Anyway, but I was 100%. God gave me this moment, called you to be a teacher. And so I went in there, marched in there to the professor, the dean of the education. She was very, very staunch, very proper, very kind of scary woman. And I was saying, she goes, so why do you want to be in the education? I said, because God's called me to it. And I was like, oh, blah, 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 and, my whole story about why. And I know this is supposed to happen. I'm supposed to help change kids' lives, and I'm like, I'm going to pour into them, and I was just like, I'm going to make a difference in their life and change the world. And she goes, I'm going to write down here starry-eyed and idealistic. I will let you in the program, because you had to apply to it. So I immediately switched everything, became an education major, and I'll tell you the rest of the story at the end. So that's a little piece, another piece of my story. So let's get to Esther chapter 5 and see what we have to say. So we're going to read this first part here. Now it came about on the third day that Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courtyard of the king's palace in front of all the king's rooms. And the king was sitting on his royal throne in the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. When the king saw Esther the queen standing in the courtyard, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended to Esther the golden scepter which was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. Then the king said to her, "What is troubling you, Queen Esther, and what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be given to you." Now let me say something real quick, in case those of you are kind of like, well, what version is this? This is the New American Standard Version. I changed it up this week. And I've told you before, if you really good way to study the Bible and understand what it's talking about is to look at different versions. So for this particular week, I wanted to do it from the New American Standard Version, which is the version I used to read a lot. It had some phrases that I really wanted to kind of highlight, and so I just changed that for this week. So in case you're like, where did that come from? That is the New American Standard. So as we read this here, just a couple of things. So what I've done is I've highlighted some of the things I'm going to talk about, so maybe make it a little easier for you to understand the flow here. So first of all, now it came about on the third day. So let's think about what does that mean, now it came about. Now this phrase is actually used a bunch of times in the Bible. It is kind of crazy how many times, 65 times. It has, in the New American Standard Version, throughout the Old Testament, it came about, now it came about, now it happened. Okay, so those phrases, if you were taking them apart, they really are sort of markers for almost like the providence of God. So now it came about, like behind the scenes, this is what happens, kind of like, so now it came about, so that really is kind of an interesting little piece to that, I wanted you to see how that phrase worked. But then you've got, so you get to this next part here, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courtyard of the king's palace in front of the king's room. She was ready, right? She was ready for this dangerous mission. And I think it's because of her time in prayer. So, we talked about the week before, so just a reminder what happened last week. It was, if you weren't here, I encourage you to listen to last week's message because it was kind of a key, chapter 4 is sort of a key chapter in the book of Esther because it was when she says, the last words that we read was, "I will go to the king, and if I perish, I perish." And we talk about the fact she told them to, all the Jews to pray, and she didn't say pray, she said fast. And me and my girls will also fast, and then I will go to the king, and if I perish, I perish. So we know without a shadow of a doubt that fasting always went with prayer. The word prayer is not listed here, but that does not mean they weren't praying. They were. It's just, it's not listed. We've already talked about this book does not actually have anything, doesn't have the word God or prayer or any of that in it, but it is, there's no doubt. Even though it's not in there, it is actually, we know it's there. Now, I found out something really interesting this week. I did some studying, and I will have to tell you that I don't know all the details of this, and I would have to do more studying, but I got enough information to tell you that actually in the Hebrew, there are some, God is in there kind of incognito. So in a acrostic, and that's in the Hebrew Bible. If you were looking at Hebrew, it's kind of hidden in there. So it is very interesting. Now that's, like, I haven't done all that, but there's a lot of commentaries that do say that. It's just I don't know all the basic details with it. But we know that she would not have been there. The fasting and prayer went together. So she has fasted, she has prayed, and now she's ready to go on this dangerous mission. I'm going, if I have to perish, I perish. I think it's beautiful, a reminder for us that if we're, when we are doing something that God has called us to do, sometimes we have a tendency, I know I do at times, to rush into things, to just go straight into it. But we can look at Esther's life and recognize that she didn't just rush in. She took her time before she went to something so difficult, so awful. She didn't just, or not awful, but so potentially dangerous. She didn't just jump into it. She prayed about it. She sought the Lord through this time of fasting, is what we can assume. And in that gave her the confidence. Look what happened here. She put on her royal robes. Remember, before that, she was fasting, which meant that she was wearing, maybe not sackcloth and ashes, but she had not been eating. So typically, when a person fasts for 3 days, they look a little rough. And they don't necessarily, that is not usually the time that you're going to go show up in your best attire looking great, But she jumps right in and puts those royal robes on and heads and stands in front of the inner court of the king's palace so that she can do that. So I think, show that. I think this is another thing that I would say. By her time in prayer, what happened is she gained a confidence and a trust in God. See, this is the thing. She really was having to go into something that was going to save the world at that time, her people. And because of that, I'm really sorry, guys, but this thing is not fitting and it's not staying, so can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. It's literally, it's bizarre. Okay, I'm just going to keep talking. So anyway, she walked forward in confidence because she had prayed first. And so oftentimes we can be very insecure about things, but we need to ask ourselves, did we pray? Did we put our trust, did we pray and ask God, what do we need to do next? What's the next direction I need to go in? Or do we just kind of go like a bull in a china shop and not stop and wait on the Lord? Because if we stop and wait for God to give us direction, we will have confidence. And we will be able to walk with this confidence that, I know God is leading me here. He's leading me in this direction. So I think, and even if you don't know exactly which way you're going, but you just move forward in the direction that God is leading you, or just the direction that you're supposed to go next, the next best move, the next step, if you have been praying about it, you can be confident that God is with you. And He will walk with you into this next place, whatever that is. So I think it's a great picture of that when you look at Esther's life. The other thing here that's kind of cool is the king, she obtained favor in his sight, and the king extended grace to her. What we know is, he said favor, but the favor is the same word that means grace. So he basically said, come on in. Now, I mentioned this last week just really briefly. Some people will say, some commentators or theologians will say that there's some typology here. So what that means is that there's certain types of people, characters in here that might represent other characters. So some people say that in a way, this is like God and Jesus is the one who intercedes for us, and like Esther. So she represents the one who intercedes on the behalf of the Jews. And she goes to the king, who is God, and he gives her the golden scepter, which is grace, and allowing her to come in to his presence, which is exactly what God, through Jesus Christ, allows us to do. He allows us to go into his presence, and he allows us to go into his presence. All right, wow, I'm a bit so, just a real quick note here. From this point on, she's called Queen Esther for the rest of the story. Very interesting. Every time she's mentioned from this point on, because she is mentioned or described as Queen Esther. Before that, it was Esther. It's kind of a curiosity here. At this point, just the fact that he is bringing her back in. Remember, she hasn't seen him in 30 days. If that was from last week. She was nervous about going in, because he had not called her for 30 days. But now he's calling her. Not only that, he begins to call her Queen Esther? What is troubling Queen Esther? So giving her that title, kind of confirming that she is in his favor, which is interesting. Okay, and then he tells her up to half the kingdom, which is basically just an hyperbole for just like, you know, you've heard this is something that kings would do. They would kind of overstate what they could do, and so it's kind of interesting that he would offer that. Okay, so verse 4, Esther said, "If it pleases the king, may the king and Haman come this day to the banquet that I have prepared for him." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet which Esther had prepared. As they drank their wine at the banquet, the king said to Esther, "What is your request? For it shall be granted to you. And what is your wish? Up to half the kingdom. It shall be done." So Esther replied, "My request and my wish is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it pleases the king to grant my request and do what I wish, may the king and Haman come to the banquet which I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king says." So this is some interesting things here. So first of all, she approaches the king with an attitude of submission and humility. I think this is kind of important here. She did understand her place. Now, and what I mean by that, when you look at, yes, when you look at these people, when you look at these Old Testament kings who demand respect, I'm just going to try this. Tape it to my face. Okay. See if you can get that one. This is insane. Okay. So anyway, Old Testament kings would obviously demand respect, and that's not just Old Testament kings, but anybody in authority. So as she goes to them, I think it's really interesting because she gives them the honor they deserve. Does he deserve it because he is worthy or because he's a good king? Not necessarily, but because of his position. So in the role that we have, even in our world today, yeah, let's see if that will work. Hello? Oh, wow. That works really well. Okay, it's okay. I'm done with this. Done. I don't know what to do. Okay. All right. So even in today's world, we want to, we may be in a situation where we have government leaders. We have other people that we don't necessarily, maybe they don't earn the respect because they are not maybe the godly or they're not making wise decisions, but because of the position they're in, we can still show them honor. And that's kind of a little bit of this picture here. She approaches him with that attitude of submission and humility, just really understanding who she was, if it pleases the king. But it also reminds us, bigger than that, much bigger than that, is how we need to come before our King of Kings, if it pleases the king. Quick story, very quick. Ken and I had this huge fight one time. We don't usually fight, we had a few, but we had this one really big one. Really big. It was like year 2 of our marriage. It was the worst. And it was a silly, now I don't even remember what it's about, honestly, but the biggest thing was he was completely wrong, and I was right. And I literally I would not let go of it. I mean, I was like, I'm not speaking to him ever again, ever. We're going to have a long life of me not talking, which is impossible. But those things come through my mind, I'm not going to talk. So it was really bad. We were with his family as we had to put on a face like we were happy, but we really weren't, because he was mad at me and I was mad at him, and I was completely, so he wanted me to do, and he didn't think I should do something. It was just a complicated thing. And I was like, I should, and you don't understand this, you're being silly and ridiculous, this doesn't make sense. It was that type of thing. It was just a total, anyway, early stages, and we were at the beach. And so I went for a walk on the beach, and I remember walking, and I was screaming. I was by myself, and I was like, God, this is ridiculous. I don't understand him. You have to do something about him. That prayer has happened a few times too. In the beginning, especially. Those first 2 or 3 years. First couple of years, actually. So I was really like, you have got to fix him. This is not cool. He's wrong. And I'm right. It was this whole thing. And I was praying, I was calling out to the Lord, and I was begging him to do something. And then I just said these words. I said, God, I just want to honor you. I just want to honor you in this marriage. And I feel like, again, the Lord spoke to me through the clouds, but he clearly said, if you want to honor me, then please your husband. Or if you want to please me, if you want to please me, then honor your husband. And I was like, really? Because that's getting really hard. But I did feel like it was the Lord. And I felt it was very clear. And I was like, okay, I gotcha. So I went back to him and I told him, I said, I'm so sorry. I said, my attitude was terrible. I still don't 100% agree with you. But I do want you to know that if this is what you really feel strongly about, and you really don't think I should do this, then I'm going to understand. I'm gonna go ahead and follow what you think is the best thing. So, I mean, it was my first experience with true submission. We've had a lot of experiences like that through the years. But this particular one was like a moment of change. It's like, that's what submission is. It's that moment of saying, I don't have to be right. It's okay. He really was doing it for my good. He really, really thought that he was protecting me. His whole attitude, the whole idea was, it was not me driving somewhere. Let's just get to the chase. It's like me driving someplace over a bunch of mountains and to get somewhere by myself. And he didn't think I should do that. And I disagreed because it was a family thing, and I've driven these mountains before. At that time, I would never do that today, but that was back in the day. And so he just didn't think it was a protection thing, and he was trying to keep me safe. And I just was like, you're ridiculous. But God just showed me, and that was a moment of understanding the concept of submission. Let it go. And I asked God, how do I do this? My family's going to be upset. He goes, I'll take care of them. You just please me. You honor me by honoring him. And guys, the whole thing turned out to be the most amazing thing. Where I went to him, I apologized, and I'm so sorry. And he said, thank you for that. And we made up, and everything was cool. We had a great vacation. I went back and talked to my family. I said, hey, I'm not going to do it. Don't ask me questions. I'm just not going to. But I didn't need to explain it to him. I'm just not going to do it. And then he called me, and he said, you know, if you want to go, it's okay. It was just the craziest thing. Out of the blue, the Lord just changed his heart. Now, I didn't end up going. But it wasn't because, it was just beautiful how God worked that out. That moment of me saying, I don't have to be right. And submission is a mutual thing, guys. It's not a one-sided thing. He submitted back to me. Like, it was like, I love you, and I recognize that this may be important to you. I'm going to go ahead and say it's okay. He was being stubborn, too, with his own thing and wasn't listening to me, and I wasn't listening to him. But at the end of the day, God took us full circle. Submission is something that is not a bad word. It is not an awful word. It is a word that the world has turned into something negative, but it is a very positive thing, and it is really the only way to have a healthy relationship. Submitting to one another out of love. Both people, 100%, both people giving to each other, not 50-50 or even 60-40. It's 100-100. We're both giving, we're both loving, unconditionally, and there's moments where I say, okay, I agree, and there's moments where he says, yeah, you're right. We work together on it. That's the beauty of biblical submission. And so that's just a little side note there for you. But Esther approaches him with an attitude of humility and submission, and then she uses discretion. No doubt about it. She understood the timing. But I won't say she understood the timing. We don't really know for sure. I'm just using that as my little extra here because there is a time to say things and there's a time to be quiet. And at this point, something was leading her, and I believe it was the providence of God telling her, don't do it yet. It's not time. She had prayed, she had prepared, and I think she was listening or being aware. And I don't think true discretion, discernment, the ability to make wise decisions comes from our own minds. It comes from the Lord and the Holy Spirit speaking to us and giving us direction. So in her case, we don't know all the details, but there's clear reason why she said, I am let's do this tomorrow. Come back tomorrow. I'm not going to bring this up today. For whatever reason, I think the Spirit was leading her. She chose not to do it, and the timing wasn't right. So we get to verse 9. Then Haman went out that day joyful and pleased of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai at the king's gate, and that he did not stand up or tremble before him, Haman was filled with anger against Mordecai. Haman controlled himself, however, and went to his house. But he sent for his friends and his wife Zeresh. Then Haman told them of the glory of his riches and his many sons and every occasion on which the king had honored him, and how he had promoted him above the officials and servants of the king. Haman also said, even Esther the queen, let no one except me come with the king to the banquet which she had prepared, and tomorrow also I am inviting her with the king. So what do we get out of this? Well, first of all, Haman's happiness was based on his circumstances. So look at him. He goes out joyful and pleased at heart because he got to be at the palace with the queen. So his happiness was based completely on his circumstances. We know that because as soon as he sees Haman at the king's gate, he did not stand up and kill him. He was filled with anger. So his entire behavior changes based on circumstances. That is not true happiness. Happiness cannot be found in our circumstances because they aren't going to always go the way we want them to. If your happiness is based on, and your satisfaction is based on what's going on in your daily life, then you're going to have a lot of days where you're not happy. So happiness is not based on circumstances, but it's just so bold and in your face. Joyful and pleased. But he was joyful and pleased because he had been lifted up and because of his pride. We'll talk about that in just a second. So his self-focus, because he was so self-focused, this made him angry and dissatisfied. So the reason why we struggle with discontentment, lack of satisfaction, and all of those things is because we become self-focused. We aren't Haman. There's nobody in this room that is evil like Haman. But we all struggle with focusing on ourselves. And that's where we will always find ourselves in an unhappy place. When you begin to focus on your problems, or even you focus on the good things in your life, and you become so caught up in that focus on yourself, focus on the things that are, even the material things that are in your life, materialism, worldly, the things that you have, and you become focused on those things, that will take away your happiness, because that is not where we find satisfaction and contentment. You will be dissatisfied and often angry. I don't know if you knew this or not, but at the root of depression is anger. Some people struggle obviously with clinical depression, and that's not what I'm really discussing here, but a lot of us deal with some depression that really could be taken care of if we deal with the deep-seated anger we have, and often that anger comes from dissatisfaction when we begin to focus on our problems. We begin to focus on ourselves. We begin to focus on things that are not going right in our life. The pity parties that we throw for ourselves, they are surefire way to get to a place of depression or hopelessness, just in a lack of happiness. A lack of happiness, because happiness isn't found in that. When Paul says, or not Paul, James in chapter 1 of James 2 and 3 says, consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. He literally says, that's where your happiness is found, in your trials. Consider it joy. We don't see it that way. We don't think of joy being a place, we don't think of our trials as being a place where we can find joy, but actually, he says, consider it joy, because what happens when you go through trials? You get stronger. It builds character. It matures you. It strengthens you, and it brings you closer to God if you cling to Him during those times of trials. So the joy, the true happiness that we're looking for is not found in worldly things. It's not found in worldly accolades. He got to go with Queen Esther. He got to hang out with her. Those worldly, the king had already raised him up. Remember, the king had put him up high as the second in command or whatever for him, and that wasn't enough for him. He was so upset because one man would not bow down to him. That one man made him unhappy. Is there one person in your life that's making your life miserable, and everybody else in your life is wonderful and they love you and they encourage you, and you've got one negative person? That is exactly how the enemy works. He will spin your world out of control from one person. That's what happened to Haman. This one person took him off the trail of having happiness and took him towards dissatisfaction, anger, and all of those things. He was obsessed with his own self-importance. I don't think there's a lot for me to say there. He's so obsessed with it that he cannot see anything else. And he goes, so this next section here, I love this verse, 13. Yet, okay, so I went to this banquet, the queen threw for me, and all of this, yet all of this does not satisfy me. Guys, what is it going to take? Do you have so many blessings in your life that there's one thing, all of that doesn't satisfy you because you're missing one thing that you think you need, that one thing, that one situation that's lacking in your life, and you're like, if I just had that, then I'd be happy. If I just had that, I would be satisfied. I mean, I have all these other blessings, but this one thing, if I had a different job, if I had a different family, that sounds really terrible, but anyway, if I had a different neighborhood, a different house, I don't like this car. Everything else in my life is great, but I don't like this whatever. This is very much where the enemy will place us, is to have our happiness and our fulfillment based on worldly things, and one thing spins us out of control. So he says, this does not satisfy me. And so he talks to his wife and friends, who are such great friends, and tell them to build a gallows 50 cubits high, which is 8 stories, by the way. That's ridiculous. I mean, like, what in the world? You couldn't even see Mordecai's face up that high. So if I tried to hang him and let everybody see him, they wouldn't even know who he was. It's 8 stories. It's ridiculous. Probably there was a building or some kind of structure already there, and so they were going to put the gallows up there. But anyway, put those gallows up there, we're going to do it. And their advice pleased him. So he had the wooden gallows made. So pride leads to a lack of contentment, no doubt. I've already talked about this a little bit, which is the opposite of happiness. So he did not satisfy him. Pride leads to destructive actions. He builds this big gallows to kill somebody. That's destructive. And that's what his pride did. And pride leads to the inability to see the truth. He was so prideful that he didn't even hear the stupidity in his friends and his life. He was so caught up in his own pride and this fact that this one man didn't bow down to him, that it caused him to miss the truth, that this doesn't even make sense. This is ridiculous. So those are some things that are clear that we can see. So we get to chapter 6, and I'm just going to quickly fly through a couple of things. I'm not going to read it because I want to get to the final part of the lesson here, but just real quick. You can't. What? Chapter 6. Oh, the last point. Pride leads to the inability to see the truth. I'm sorry. And I will post these on the PowerPoint. Okay, so chapter 6, I'm not going to read it, but remember what happens. The king can't sleep. Isn't that interesting? Why can the king not sleep? Now, this in the Bible, we see this happen in a couple of different places where the king can't sleep. The king couldn't sleep with Joseph, and he was having dreams, and Joseph had to come in and give him the meaning of his dreams. And then but it's clear that this is really where we can see that the hand of God must be keeping him from sleeping. So I can't sleep. So I want to read the book of records of all the things that have happened in the Persian world. So that sounds really boring. You probably was thinking, I need something boring so I can fall asleep. So give me those records. But what's interesting is the Persians kept this is actually very historically accurate. The Persians kept very detailed records. So there would have been a list of all these records, right? There would have been tons of stuff. But he turns to just the right spot. He can't sleep. And now he's got to find something to do, so he decides to read the book of records. And then he turns to just the spot where it talks about what Mordecai did. Mordecai saving his life. And so he's like, wonder what, and then he asks, what honor or dignity has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? Because it was very common to give to give some sort of reward to somebody who had saved your life from assassination. I mean, it's kind of a big deal, right? And he said, what was done for him? And they said, nothing. And then so the king said, who is in the court? Haman had just entered the outer courtyard. Now, what was Haman going to do? He was coming to say, I want to hang Mordecai on the gallows. So that was, but before he gets there, the king has read about Mordecai, and so all of this has to be the hand of God. There's no way the coincidence could be, it's not a coincidence, right? We don't have that. So where the point's here, God is keeping him awake. That's what I say. I put a question mark, but literally, he is keeping him awake. I think that's why he can't sleep. I don't know if y'all struggle with sleep, but we could start looking at life this way. When we can't sleep, maybe God's keeping us awake for a reason. So go read something boring. Or, I always tell people whenever they can't sleep, I'm like, read a book. And maybe you can make a boring one. That will help you fall asleep. Trust me. Watching TV typically doesn't help you fall asleep because of the blue lights and technology and everything, computers. So reading is a good thing. But anyway, so then often good deeds may be overlooked, but don't give up. God is working behind the scenes. Because what we find is, remember Mordecai, his good works were not covered back in the when he first did them, but now Mordecai is going to be rewarded. And then we have this whole ironic entrance of Haman showing up at this time. So then we get to this next part here is, Haman comes in, he asks Haman what you should do for somebody, and of course you know the story. He tells him to parade him around town and give him the royal robes and the ring and tell everybody this is what happens to the man who the king desires to honor. So pride causes us to have an inward focus in two ways. So right there it says, immediately when the king asks this question, the first thing that comes to Haman's mind is, well, who else would he be thinking about honoring besides me? He could only see himself. And I put a note on here because pride causes us to have an inward focus, as I already mentioned about just this whole idea of if you think about when you are, and I keep using the word depressed, but there's days we know is when we get down and we have the pity parties. Oftentimes what happens is you don't see it as pride, but that's really what it is sometimes. It is pride in the opposite way. So we have pride when we think too much of ourselves, but it's also prideful to think too little of yourself. When you begin to think, well, I'm just the worst mom in the world, and I'm just terrible, and nobody really likes me, it's self-focus. It's still about you. It may be a negative, it may be an insecurity, but ultimately, it's still pride. Because God created you in His image, you are perfect in Him. You're exactly how He wanted you. There's nothing missing in you that He did not want to have it. You are the person that God made you to be, and there is nothing that's lacking. So when you start talking bad about yourself, you start looking down on yourself, you become prideful in the opposite way. So pride works in both ways. It's an inward focused emotion. And God really hit me over the head with this past week in my own life. And as I was reading this, it's like, oh my gosh, God forgive me because I am being prideful. And it was an insecurity. I put that, but it became something that I was focusing on myself too much. The best way to get out of that self-focus is to look outward, to start looking at people. Haman didn't look at anybody but himself, including his wife and his friends. He just called them in to build him up, right? Is there times that you are having conversations with people and you just want them to build you up? It's all about you. What about you flip the script? Why don't you start building other people up? Why don't you start looking for how you can serve, how you can love, how you can look outward instead of inward when things aren't going well? Looking outward could change everything. Start looking at other people and we can see how God works. There's a couple of verses here. The righteous is delivered from trouble, but the wicked takes his place. Before destruction, the heart of man is haughty, Haman. But humility goes before honor, Mordecai. A man's pride will bring him low, Haman, but a humble spirit will obtain honor, Mordecai. So which side of the comma are you on there? Are you on the front or the back? Okay, so what are our big takeaways? I'm just going to skip on down. We know that he was humiliated by having to walk Mordecai through the town. His pride brought his humiliation. Instead of him building him up, he was so prideful that he was humiliated. Oftentimes, that's a result of our pride. Pride leads to the loss of support and admiration from others. His wife and his friends said, well, you're going to be in trouble. If he's a Jew, you're in big trouble. So I want to wrap up with this last point here. So places matter. I've got 3 points for you. Pride is dangerous and always leads to places we don't want to go. I think that is, we've already talked about it a good bit, so I'm not going to say a lot more about it, but I just want you to think about that big message here. Pride is dangerous, both positive and the negative. If you are feeling bad about yourself and you're becoming prideful that way, you're inward and you don't look outward, and you're not spending time helping other people, you get into a depression. But if you're prideful the other side, look at me, look at all my great things, you will not be happy, because that is not where happiness is. You will not be satisfied. You will not be content. Number 2, humility is the place we want to be. Humility is, I read this really great quote. It says, pride is your greatest enemy, humility is your greatest friend. Humility is that attitude of recognizing who you are before a holy God. That's what humility is. He is God and I am not. He has placed me here. He has put me in this world for a reason and a purpose, and I just trust him where I am, and I recognize that he's God. I'm not going to try to do his job for him. I'm not going to try to take his place. And then this last one. God uses us in places we don't expect. I want to tell you a quick story, 2 quick stories, or a quick story and then wrap up my story. I'm going to tell you about a man in our church. He is, his story is so cool. He grew up just like a lot of little boys wanting to be a Major League Baseball player, and actually got to do that for a few years. But after he left that job, and because that always comes to an end at some point, he went into scouting. And his idea was, I'm sure it just was, wanted to stay in the baseball world and work for the world of baseball. But what happened was, while he was there in this job as a baseball scout, he begins to have a brand new calling. So he's in the middle of this. He is just doing his scouting job, but God starts giving him this opportunity to share the gospel and disciple coaches all over the country. This is not what he thought his calling was. He thought he was called to be a scout. He just went as a scout and was doing the scouting job because he knows Major League Baseball, and that was his job. But while he was there, in the midst of just the job, God gives him a higher calling, a different reason for why he's doing scouting. Now, he's got a huge network of coaches all over the country that he shares Christ with, that he disciples. And in that, in turn, they are discipling their players. And there's a huge movement within Major League Baseball because of this man's new calling that God gave him. But it was while he was working as a scout. And he still is doing his job as a scout, but while he's there is a bigger calling. If you look at, and his name is Kevin Burrell, by the way, and his wife is right there. But if you look at his story, I asked him, I said, did you ever imagine that God would use you this way? He said, no idea. I just thought I was going to be a scout. And now he is changing the world, one baseball player at a time. This is what happened when God changed my whole direction and put me in education. See, I had absolutely I just went as a teacher, but I did think I was going to change the world, but that was a little starry-eyed, idealistic, all of that. But while I was there, God gave me a different, he used me while I was there. So I went in to teach. I went in to encourage and inspire young people, and hopefully I did that in different places and ways throughout the years, and I know that God used me. But in that, he also placed me in a school out in Texas and in a place where I found out about World Book Encyclopedias, which also led me to work in that job so that Ken was able to find his way. So by me being in teaching, then God used that little piece, and that was so there was a bigger picture to that, but then you move on to, I moved here to Georgia, and then we start Crossroads, and then I start working at Trinity Christian School. And I ended up staying there for 20 years and helped build the high school. Was the first high school teacher or whatever. In the midst of that, though, my reason for being there was not just those students. It was a much bigger calling. It wasn't just, yes, it was a Christian school, so I got a chance to share, but I look at the opportunities I had to invest in young people. I've got some of them in this room here that were in my life, and I have no doubt in my mind that I'm not just a teacher. There was something much bigger. There was a reason I was in that calling, and it was really a huge part of even the church as well, and just kind of how we've been placed here in Coweta County and all that. So God uses us in places we don't expect. So you're sitting in a job, you're sitting in a place. We talked about this a little bit last week, but just remember when Esther went to the king, she walked in there with those robes. She came in after the prayer time in the very beginning, that first verse that we read, and she shows up. I am pretty sure, like 100% sure, that Esther did not plan to be a queen. And that was not her calling. Her calling, she had other things that she probably dreamed of doing as a young girl. And she grows up and she gets placed in the palace. That just ended up happening, not even by her own choice. But while she was there, while she was following and just being obedient, God used her to change the world, to save the Jews. He can use you right where you're placed right now. That might be your new calling. You might have thought you were called to work in medical. You might have thought you were called to work as a teacher, but there's something much bigger that God has, saving the world. One patient at a time, one student at a time, one whatever the Lord has. So I encourage you to see your life through a little bit of the eyes of this story of Esther, the providence of God, working, moving, placing you where you need to be. And let's just give him the glory, because he's going to do great things if we just put our lives in him and trust him every step of the way. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I just thank you again for this night and for your word that is so rich and powerful. And I just pray for all the ladies in this room that they would be inspired to recognize and try to look at their lives as that they are in places that you have supernaturally put them, and that you can work in the midst of whatever they're doing to make a difference in the world. And so, God, I pray that you would just give them that new inspiration for how they are to walk in that. And Lord, we just love you. We praise you. Thank you for what you're going to do in our lives and through us. Use us this week and speak to us through your word. We just pray these things in your son's name. Amen. Thank you, ladies.